Good evening, or perhaps it's very late at night where you are. Perhaps you've been lying there for a while now, watching the ceiling, waiting for your thoughts to slow down on their own. That's all right. You don't have to do anything for the next couple of hours except listen or not listen. Nothing important will happen here. Nothing you'll need to remember in the morning. This is the sleepy history of medicine. Long, slow documentaries about how human beings have tried to heal each other, told quietly, at the pace of a fireside story. You're welcome to fall asleep at any point. That is, in fact, the whole idea. The chapters are gentle, the transitions are soft, and if you drift off during the Mercury cures and wake up somewhere in the Radium Craze, you won't have missed anything you can't catch some other night. Tonight's subject is one of the oldest and, in its own way, one of the most comforting stories there is. The history of cures that didn't work. Miracle medicines. Universal antidotes. Tonics and elixirs and powders and belts. The strange, earnest, occasionally ridiculous things people have swallowed, applied, inhaled, and strapped to themselves over 5,000 years in the simple hope of feeling better. It would be easy to laugh at all of it, and now and then we will. A little. But mostly this is a story about people doing their best with what they had. A mother in ancient Egypt spooning honey onto a wound. A Roman emperor taking his daily spoonful of a 60-ingredient antidote, just in case. A Victorian gentleman sipping radium water because the advertisement promised him vigor. They were wrong, most of them, about most of it, but they were wrong carefully and hopefully, and for reasons that made perfect sense at the time. And here and there, hidden among the quackery, we'll find the occasional cure that actually worked, sometimes thousands of years before anyone understood why. So, settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. We have a long way to travel tonight, from the banks of the Nile to the plague markets of medieval Europe, to the medicine shows of the American frontier, and none of it needs to be traveled quickly. Chapter 1. The Oldest Medicines. Long before there were doctors, there were cures. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because we tend to imagine it the other way around. But healing did not begin as a profession. It began as a guess. Thousands and thousands of guesses made by ordinary people over thousands of years. Someone's child had a fever. Someone's father had a wound that wouldn't close. And someone nearby, a grandmother, a neighbor, a priest, reached for something. A leaf, a paste, a word spoken over the sickbed. And if the patient recovered, the guess was remembered. That is the entire engine of ancient medicine. The guesses that got remembered. The oldest medical documents we have come from Egypt, written on long rolls of papyrus more than 3,500 years ago. The most celebrated of these is called the Eber's Papyrus, a scroll more than 20 meters long, copied out around 1550 BC, though the remedies inside it were already old when the scribe sat down to work. It is, in a sense, the oldest pharmacy manual on Earth, and it is a genuinely wonderful document, because it contains, side by side, with no distinction whatsoever between them, remedies that are astonishingly sensible and remedies that are not. On the sensible side, honey. The Egyptians put honey on wounds, packed it into dressings, mixed it with grease and lint into something recognizably like a modern bandage. And here's the quiet miracle of it. Honey works. It is mildly antiseptic. It draws moisture out of a wound. Bacteria struggle to grow in it, which is also why a jar of honey essentially never spoils. Sealed honey has been found in Egyptian tombs, 3,000 years old, still perfectly good. The Egyptians knew none of the chemistry. They simply noticed that wounds dressed with honey festered less often than wounds that weren't, and they remembered. Modern medicine, after a long detour, has circled back. Medical-grade honey dressings sit in hospital supply rooms today. A pharmacist can order them. The oldest remedy in the oldest medical book still has a product code. On the other side of the ledger, and the Eber's Papyrus does not blush about this, is dung. Crocodile dung, gazelle dung, donkey, dog, and fly dung, each with its own indications, its own preparations. Some were mixed into ointments, some were burned so the smoke could be inhaled. To the Egyptian mind, this was not absurd, it was logical. Illness was often understood as something foul that had taken up residence in the body, and what better way to evict a foul thing than with something fouler? Disgust was the active ingredient. The demon of disease, the thinking went, would simply refuse to stay. It did not work, of course. Some of it caused precisely the infections it was meant to prevent. But notice the shape of the reasoning. Illness is an intruder, and medicine is a way of making the body inhospitable to it. Squint, and you can almost see the distant silhouette of germ theory, 4,000 years ahead of schedule, drawn entirely in the wrong colors. The Egyptians also gave us one of the earliest recorded painkillers. The papyri mention the poppy, its juice given, among other things, to soothe crying children. That thin, bitter latex from the seed head of Papaver somniferum contains morphine, and its story, through Greek medicine, Arabic pharmacy, Victorian laudanum, and the modern world's long trouble with it, is so large that it will get an entire episode of its own, another night. For now, it's enough to note that among the dung and the incantations, the ancient world had found, and would never again lose, the most powerful pain reliever nature ever made. And then there is the oldest surgery we know of, older than Egypt, older than writing itself, trepanation, the drilling or scraping of a hole in the living skull. Stone Age skulls have been found across the world, France, Peru, North Africa, with neat, deliberate openings in them. This alone would be remarkable. What is more remarkable is that many of the openings show smooth, healed bone around the edges. The patient survived. Not always, but often. By some counts, more often than skull surgery patients in European hospitals of the 1800s, who had the misfortune of being operated on in buildings full of germs no one believed in yet, by surgeons who saw no reason to wash their coats. Why did prehistoric people do it? Nobody can say for certain. Perhaps to release spirits believed to be trapped in the head, the headache, the seizure, the madness given a door to leave by. Perhaps more practically, to lift a shard of broken skull off a wounded brain, which is a thing modern neurosurgeons still do. Probably both, in different places, for different patients. The hole in the skull is the guess that got remembered, 12,000 years running. Egypt, it should be said, left us more than one papyrus, and the other great one deserves a moment before we move on, because it complicates the picture in the most flattering way. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a copy of a text far older still, is not a book of remedies at all. It is a surgical manual, 48 cases, arranged with beautiful method from the crown of the head downward, wounds, fractures, dislocations, and there is scarcely a demon anywhere in it. Each case is examined, probed, plainly described, and then each receives one of 3 verdicts, repeated like a quiet refrain. An ailment I will treat, an ailment with which I will contend, and, remarkably, an ailment not to be treated. Some patients, the unknown surgeon understood, could not be saved, and he said so in writing thousands of years ago, without excuse or incantation. Medicine has needed that honest sentence ever since, and has not always managed to say it. And tucked among the Ebers, Papyrus's hundreds of remedies is one more sleeper worth naming: willow. Decoctions of willow leaves and bark for aches, for heat, for swellings. Willow bark contains a bitter substance called salicin, and if that word sounds faintly familiar, it should, because salicin is the botanical grandparent of salicylic acid, which chemists at a German dye company tamed and bottled in 1899 under the trade name aspirin. The most ordinary medicine in your cabinet tonight, the one beside the bandages, the one nobody thinks about, is an Egyptian remedy that waited 4,000 years for chemistry to catch up and explain why it had been right all along. What unites all of it, the honey and the dung, the poppy and the drill, is that none of it was random. Every remedy came wrapped in an explanation. The explanations were wrong mostly. Demons, vapors, foulness, trapped spirits. But they were explanations, and that mattered enormously, because a cure with a story attached is a cure people believe in, and a cure people believe in gets remembered and passed down and refined. A modern pharmacist, standing behind a counter 4,000 years later, would recognize the instinct immediately. Patients have never really wanted a molecule. They want the story. What this is, why it will help, why things are going to be all right. The molecule has gotten much better. The need for the story hasn't changed at all. The trouble, of course, is that a good story doesn't need to be true to survive. It only needs to be told well. And in the next chapter, we'll meet the best told story in the entire history of pharmacy. A single medicine so famous, so trusted, and so magnificently complicated that kings kept it beside their thrones and cities staged public festivals just to watch it being made. 60 ingredients, snake flesh, years of aging, like wine. It was called Theriac, and for 1,500 years, it was the most celebrated drug on earth. It did almost nothing. Almost. But that's for the next chapter. There's no hurry. There was never any hurry. Chapter 2. Theriac, the universal cure. Every age has its miracle drug. Ours arrive in blister packs with names invented by committees. The ancient worlds came in a jar, took months to make, years to age, and contained, by most recipes, more than 60 ingredients, including, famously, the flesh of vipers. It was called Theriac, and for roughly 1,500 years, it was the most trusted medicine on Earth. The story begins, as many pharmacy stories do, with a man who was afraid of being poisoned. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus on the shores of the Black Sea in the 1st century before Christ. He had reason to worry. Poisoning was, at the time, more or less the standard method for retiring a king early. So Mithridates, who was clever, curious, and enormously patient, set out to make himself immune. Every day, so the story goes, he swallowed small doses of every poison he could obtain, slowly training his body to tolerate them. And alongside this regimen, he developed a compound antidote. Dozens of ingredients, ground and blended and taken daily, meant to shield him from anything an assassin might slip into his cup. Whether any of it worked is very much open to question. But the legend has a magnificent ending. When Mithridates was finally cornered by the Romans and tried to end his own life by poison, the poison, so the story insists, failed. He had made himself too immune to die. He had to ask a soldier to finish the job with a sword instead. You should be at least a little suspicious of that story. Ancient historians rarely let the truth spoil a good ending. But the recipe, or something claiming to be the recipe, traveled to Rome, and there it began its extraordinary career. It was Nero's personal physician, a Cretan named Andromachus, who perfected the formula. And by perfected, I mean he added snake, viper flesh to be precise, dried and worked into the mixture on the elegant logic that a creature so full of venom must also contain the power to resist it. Andromachus brought the ingredient count to around 64. Opium, myrrh, saffron, cinnamon, ginger, iris, gentian, rose petals, wine, honey to bind it all into a dark, thick paste, and on, a whole spice market compressed into a single spoonful. He named it Theriac, from the Greek word for wild beasts, because it was meant, above all, to cure their bites. But a medicine with 64 ingredients does not stay humble for long. If it cured snake bite, why not scorpion stings? If scorpion stings, why not fevers, plague, poor digestion, sadness? By the time the great physician Galen wrote an entire book about it in the 2nd century, Theriac had become what every drug secretly dreams of becoming, a cure for everything. Emperors took it daily, a small preventative lick of paste each morning, the way one might take a vitamin. And we have, from Galen himself, a wonderfully intimate account of the most famous patient of all, the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who took his Theriac every day and whose imperial batches Galen personally compounded. No market Theriac for the master of the Roman world. Galen records, with the physician's careful pride, how the emperor found the daily dose made him drowsy at his duties, so the poppy juice was reduced, whereupon Marcus began lying awake at night, and the poppy was restored and adjusted until the balance suited. Read that again, slowly, and you realize what you're looking at. The most powerful man on earth and the most famous doctor in history patiently titrating an opium dose against side effects 18 centuries before anyone would call it that. The pharmacology was medieval before its time. The conversation This makes me drowsy. Then let's lower it. Now I can't sleep. Then let's split the difference. Is one your own pharmacist has had 1,000 times across the counter this year. And for the next 1,000 years and more, Theriac simply never went away. It survived the fall of Rome. It traveled into the Islamic world, where the great physicians of Baghdad and Cordoba refined it and wrote commentaries on it. It came back into Europe with the Crusades and settled, most famously, in Venice. And Venice understood something wonderful. Theriac was not just a medicine. It was theater. The recipe was so long, so expensive, and so easy to fake that the city made its production a public ceremony. Once a year, the ingredients were laid out in the open, all 60-some of them, arranged in rows outside the apothecary shops, so that officials and citizens alike could inspect them. The mixing was done in public, in great bronze mortars, sometimes over days, to prove that nothing had been left out and nothing cheap slipped in. Then the finished paste was sealed and aged, like wine, for years before sale. Venetian Theriac, and Venice treacle, as the English called it, became one of the most valuable trade goods in Europe. And yes, that is where the English word treacle comes from. Before it ever meant syrup on a pudding, it meant the universal cure. Did it work? Mostly no. Against actual snakebite, it did nothing at all. Against plague, nothing. The dozens of herbs, whatever their individual merits, were ground together in quantities too small to matter. But, and here is the almost we promised, Theriac contained opium. Real opium in a real dose. A spoonful of Theriac eased pain. It quieted coughs. It settled the bowels, and it granted sleep to the sick and the frightened. A patient who took Theriac felt better, genuinely, within the hour. It was not curing them. It was comforting them, which for most of history was the most that medicine could honestly offer, and is not nothing. A modern pharmacist would recognize Theriac instantly, though not by its ingredients. They'd recognize it by its shape, the expensive brand name, the secret formula, the celebrity endorsement, the one active ingredient doing all the work while 60 passengers ride along for the mystique. The packaging changes. The shape never does. Theriac was still listed in respectable pharmacy books in the 1700s. It faded slowly, without scandal, the way old remedies do, quietly demoted, decade by decade, from cure-all to curiosity to footnote. But if the idea of medicine made from vipers strikes you as strange, the next chapter is stranger. Because for several centuries, respectable European apothecaries, licensed, educated, entirely serious men, kept a drawer behind the counter for an ingredient we can only call people. Don't worry, it's a gentler story than it sounds. Most things are, told slowly enough. Chapter 3. Corpse Medicine. Of all the remedies in this episode, this is the one your ancestors would be most surprised to find on the list. Because for about 400 years, in the most educated corners of Europe, Medicine made from human remains was not shocking at all. It was ordinary. It sat on the shelf between the rhubarb and the rose water, and it had a price per ounce, and the price was high. It began, like a surprising number of historical mix-ups, with a translation problem. Persian physicians had long prized a black, tarry mineral called mum, a natural bitumen that seeped from certain mountains, used for wounds and bruises and broken bones. In Arabic medical texts, it became mumia. When European scholars translated those texts, they went looking for this marvelous black substance, and someone noticed that the embalmed bodies of ancient Egypt were coated in something dark and resinous that looked rather like it. You can see where this is going. The word mumia attached itself to the embalmed dead. It is, in fact, where our word mummy comes from. And somewhere along the way, the medicine and the mummy became one and the same. Europe decided, on the strength of a mistranslation, that the healing substance wasn't the tar on the body. It was the body. And so began one of history's strangest import trades. Genuine Egyptian mummies were broken up, ground down, and sold across Europe as mumia, a brown powder prescribed for epilepsy, bruising, internal bleeding, and a dozen other complaints. Demand ran so far ahead of supply that enterprising merchants in Alexandria began producing counterfeits, which is a sentence worth pausing on. There were forgers whose specific crime was selling fake mummy powder. Recently deceased unfortunates, hastily dried in the sun and passed off as 4,000-year-old pharaohs. Apothecaries learned to grade the merchandise. The finest mumia, the connoisseur said, was glossy and black and smelled faintly of resin. Nor was powdered mummy the only item in this peculiar pharmacy. There was usnea, a moss that grew on old skulls, scraped off and prized for ailments of the head, on the pleasing logic that like cures like. There was human fat, rendered and sold for rheumatism. And in Rome, centuries earlier, there had been the grimmest folk remedy of all. Fresh blood, taken warm as a supposed cure for epilepsy, a belief that persisted at public executions in parts of Europe well into the 1800s, where the afflicted would line up, cup in hand. The strangest entry in the whole grim catalog comes from the far end of the world, and, this is the comforting part, it comes pre-fact-checked. The great Chinese pharmacologist Li Shizhen, compiling his monumental drug encyclopedia in the 1500s, recorded a story he had heard from Arabia, the legend of the mellified man. An elderly volunteer, so the tale went, would give himself over entirely to honey, eating nothing else, bathing in it, until honey was, more or less, all he was. And after his death, the body was steeped in honey for 100 years more, then sold in small amber pieces as a confection that healed broken limbs. It is almost certainly pure legend. No evidence survives that anyone, anywhere, actually did this. And the lovely detail is that Li Shizhen thought so too. He wrote it down and carefully marked it as hearsay, unverified. A pharmacist in the 1500s, filing a miracle cure under needs a citation. He is, in his way, the patron saint of this entire episode. Back in Europe, meanwhile, the trade had a supply chain, and the supply chain had a middleman you might not expect, the executioner. In the German lands especially, the public executioner ran a quiet and entirely legal side business in remedies. Human fat, sold under the matter-of-fact name poor sinner's fat, rubbed on for rheumatism and sprains. And for a small fee, the touch of the hangman's hand itself, believed to cure growths and swellings. Many executioners were, in practice, their town's busiest healers. They had, after all, an unrivaled knowledge of anatomy, acquired professionally. Respectable citizens who crossed the street to avoid the man by daylight knocked at his door after dark, jar in hand. Told quickly, all this sounds like barbarism. Told slowly, it's something more poignant. The reasoning underneath it was almost tender. The body is full of life, of vital spirit, and death, especially sudden death, traps that vitality inside. To consume some small part of it was to borrow the life that its owner no longer needed. It was wrong, but it was wrong in a very human direction. And it went all the way to the top. King Charles II of England, witty, worldly, patron of the Royal Society, the most scientifically fashionable monarch of his age, paid a fortune for the private recipe of a remedy called Goddard's Drops, which he took to preparing in his own laboratory. Its principal ingredient was human skull, broken and distilled in a flask until it yielded a pungent spirit. The court called the result the King's Drops, and Charles swore by them. A few drops in wine for faintness, apoplexy, or low spirits. When he collapsed in February of 1685, dying, his physicians gave him the King's Drops among their many desperate treatments. They did not save him, though to be fair to the skull, neither did the bleeding, the purging, nor anything else on the menu that week. Corpse medicine faded the way Theriac faded, not banned, just slowly abandoned, as the Enlightenment's new chemistry found nothing in bone and mumia worth having, and changing sensibilities made the whole business feel, at last, like what it was. By the early 1800s, mummy had migrated from the pharmacy to the paint box. Ground mummy lingered longest, oddly, as a pigment called mummy brown, beloved by certain painters for its warm translucence. A modern pharmacist reading those old inventories feels a strange kinship even so, because the instinct underneath, that the human body itself contains the medicine, didn't die. It was simply waiting for better tools. We transfuse blood, we graft skin, we transplant organs, and we make drugs from human proteins grown in careful vats. The apothecaries were right that the body holds the cure. They were only wrong about which bodies and how and why. So far, our remedies have at least had ingredients, vipers, spices, unfortunate pharaohs. But the next chapter is about a cure that worked by subtraction. For over 2,000 years, the single most common medical procedure in the Western world was to open a vein and let the illness run out. It had logic. It had instruments. It had, of all things, a barber. Chapter 4. The Four Humors and the Long Reign of Bloodletting. If you had to explain all of sickness, every fever, every ache, every sorrow, with only the science available 2,000 years ago, you could do a great deal worse than the theory of the four humors. It was wrong, but it was beautifully wrong. Tidy, symmetrical, and so intuitively satisfying that it governed Western medicine for longer than almost any idea has governed anything. It went like this. The body contains 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each has its qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry. Each corresponds to a season, an element, a temperament. In health, the 4 sit in balance, like a well-tuned chord. In sickness, one of them has grown too strong, and the physician's whole art is to find the excess and drain it away. Vomiting, purging, sweating, blistering, each had its place. But the king of them all, the treatment of first resort for 20 centuries, was bloodletting. Blood was the hot, wet humor, the one most prone to abundance. Fever? Too much blood. Headache? Too much blood. Inflammation, restlessness, apoplexy, a troublesome temper? You begin to see the pattern. The procedure itself was almost ceremonial. The patient's arm bound, the vein raised, the little blade, called a lancet, a word that would one day, with no irony at all, become the name of a great medical journal. Open the vein with a practiced flick, and the blood ran into a shallow brass bowl marked with rings to measure the ounces. The physician watched the patient's face, felt the pulse, and judged when balance had returned. Often that judgment was when the patient fainted. Fainting, you see, was considered a promising sign. And here is a detail you may already know, though it's pleasant to hear again at low volume. Physicians, for much of this history, considered surgery and bleeding rather beneath their dignity. They diagnosed, others cut. The cutting fell to the barbers, who already owned the sharpest blades in town. Barber surgeons pulled teeth, lanced boils, and opened veins between haircuts, and they advertised with a pole outside the shop. Red for blood, white for bandages, wound in a spiral like the stained linens hung out to dry. The barber's pole still turns outside shops today, a quiet little monument to the days when a shave and a bleeding were adjacent services. The astonishing thing about bloodletting is not that it was tried. It's how long it lasted and how completely it was believed, by patients as much as physicians. People asked to be bled, seasonally, preventatively, the way we schedule a dental cleaning. Monasteries kept bleeding calendars, and the practice sailed on, serene and untroubled, straight through the Renaissance, past the discovery of the circulation of the blood and into the age of powdered wigs, where it met on a cold December night in 1799, its most famous patient. George Washington, 67 years old, retired at Mount Vernon, woke in the small hours struggling to breathe. Most likely, modern physicians think, a severe bacterial infection of the throat. His overseer, and then a procession of doctors, did what the very best care of 1799 prescribed. They bled him, and bled him again, and again. By the day's end, something like 5 pints, roughly 40% of everything he had, drawn from the most important arm in America. He died that evening, calm and dignified to the last. We can't say the bleeding killed him, but no one now believes it helped him carry a grave infection through the night. Before we bury the humors, pause to notice how much of them you still carry, because the theory never really died. It retired into the English language. A cheerful, optimistic person is sanguine. From the Latin for blood, the warm humor. Someone calm to the point of impassive is phlegmatic. The quick-tempered are choleric, yellow bile, and sadness itself is melancholy, which is simply Greek for black bile, the cold, dry humor of sorrow. When you say a friend is in good humor, you are diagnosing them humorally. Even temperament began as a technical term. Your personal blend, your mixture of the four. 2,000 years of medicine, wrong from top to bottom, and its entire vocabulary is still in your mouth. Ideas that lose in the clinic can win in the dictionary. The 1800s actually increased the appetite for a while, and nowhere more spectacularly than in France, where a Napoleonic army surgeon named Francois Broussais rose to fame on the theory that nearly every disease was, at bottom, an inflammation of the digestive tract, and that the remedy was leeches, applied by the dozen, sometimes by the 50, across the abdomen. Under his influence, France's medical appetite outran its pawns entirely. By the 1830s, the country was importing leeches by the tens of millions each year, gathered by leech collectors who waded bare-legged into marshes and let the harvest come to them, which is surely among the least enviable jobs in this whole history. Pharmacies displayed ornate ceramic leech jars on the counter, pierced lids and all, as proudly as any modern shop displays its scales. Fashionable ladies wore embroidery of little leeches on their gowns. It was a mania. The last florid, magnificent flare of humoral medicine before the lights came on. But the century that loved bleeding most was also the century that finally counted. Physicians in Paris and Vienna began keeping honest tallies. So many bled, so many recovered, so many not. And the numbers, dispassionate and patient, said what no authority had dared to. It made no difference, or worse. Against arithmetic, even Galen had no reply. By the century's end, the brass bowls were going into cabinets in museums. And yet, here is this chapter's quiet pharmacist's footnote. Bloodletting never entirely left. Walk into any modern hospital and you will find it, renamed and redeemed. Therapeutic phlebotomy, prescribed for the iron overload disease hemochromatosis and for blood grown too thick with red cells. For those few patients, the oldest treatment in the book is still the right one. 2,000 years of bleeding everyone for everything. And it turned out to be the correct treatment for almost nothing, but not quite nothing. Medicine rarely throws an idea away completely. It just files it under a much narrower heading. The humoral physicians drained what the body had too much of. The next chapter is about the opposite instinct, adding something, a gleaming, liquid, silver something, the loveliest substance in the old pharmacy, and very nearly the deadliest. For 400 years, Europe took its most feared disease to the mercury jar, and paid for it, a little at a time. Chapter 5. Mercury, the beautiful poison. Of all the substances humanity has mistaken for medicine, none was loved longer, or trusted more, or forgiven more often than Mercury. And you can understand why the moment you picture it. Every other metal sits in the hand, cold and dead. Mercury moves. Tip the flask and it gathers itself into trembling silver beads. Pour it, and it runs like something alive. The ancients called it quicksilver, living silver, and alchemists across 3 continents became quietly convinced that a metal so restless, so luminous, so unlike everything else in the world must be close to the secret of life itself. That conviction cost a remarkable number of lives, beginning at the very top. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified the warring states, standardized the written script, and ordered the making of the terracotta army, spent his final years in pursuit of immortality, and his physicians and alchemists assured him that preparations of Mercury were the road to it. He took them faithfully. He died at 49 on tour, far from home, quite possibly of his medicine, and was laid in a tomb that ancient historians describe as containing whole rivers of flowing mercury, a silver landscape for a silver-poisoned king. Modern soil surveys of the burial mound, it's worth saying softly, really do show mercury levels far above normal. The rivers may actually be there, still flowing in the dark. But Mercury's great career in Western medicine began in the 1490s, when a terrifying new disease swept through Europe. Syphilis. Nothing in the old books matched it, and in the panic, physicians reached for the strongest thing on the shelf. Mercury at least did something, rubbed on as ointment. Its effects were visible, dramatic, undeniable. Patients were salved and steamed in mercury vapor barrels and dosed until they drooled, literally. Copious salivation was believed to be the disease pouring out of the body, so the physician kept increasing the dose until the patient produced pints of it. The drooling, the loosened teeth, the trembling hands, all of it, we now know, was simply mercury poisoning, arriving on schedule. At the time, it was read as the cure taking hold. And because syphilis moves in slow waves, flaring, then hiding for months or years on its own, every natural remission was credited to the quicksilver. The treatment could last years. A whole mordant proverb grew up around it. One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. For 400 years, that was the standard of care. By the 17 and 1800s, Mercury had settled into the pharmacy's most respectable drawer in the form of a Swedish white powder called calomel, mercurous chloride. Calomel was the aspirin of its day, the thing you took first for nearly anything. It purged the bowels magnificently, which in humoral thinking meant it was working. America's most famous physician, Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, hero of the yellow fever epidemics, believed in calomel with his whole heart and dosed his patients with quantities that make modern toxicologists go quiet. When Lewis and Clark set out across the continent, Rush supplied the expedition with his own pills. Calomel-laden purgatives, so forceful the men called them thunderclappers. And here is one of history's most charming footnotes. worth savoring slowly. Because mercury passes through the body and does not rust away, archaeologists were able to identify the expedition's camp at Traveler's Rest in Montana 200 years later, partly by the mercury still waiting in the soil beneath the latrine. It remains, to this day, the only campsite on the entire trail confirmed by physical evidence. The expedition signed the continent exactly once, and it signed in quicksilver. The saddest chapter is the smallest. Well into the 20th century, calomel was an ingredient in teething powders for infants, rubbed on sore gums, sold at every chemist's. Some of those babies developed a mysterious illness of pink, peeling hands and misery called pink disease, whose cause wasn't pinned to the mercury until around 1950. And Abraham Lincoln, in his melancholy years before the presidency, took a common remedy called blue mass. Mercury worked into little pills for his low moods and constipation. Contemporaries describe rages and tremors in those years that fit mercury poisoning uncomfortably well. Lincoln himself, with characteristic shrewdness, noticed the pills made him worse, and, by most accounts, largely set them aside after taking office. It is pleasant to think the steadiest hand of 1865 belonged to a man who had quietly deprescribed himself. And mercury's reach ran past the pharmacy entirely, into the workshops, which is where it left its mark on the language. The finest felt hats of the age were made from fur, and the fur was worked loose with a brush of mercury nitrate solution, a process called carroting for the orange stain it left. Hat-making towns, Danbury, Connecticut, proudly styled itself the hat capital of the world, were full of men who spent decades leaning over steaming basins of the stuff. And slowly, quietly, the hatters changed. Their hands developed a tremor. The hatters' shakes, or in America, the Danbury shakes. Their speech slurred. They grew shy, irritable, strange. The phrase mad as a hatter was common coin decades before Lewis Carroll sat his own hatter down to tea. Carroll didn't invent the madness. He borrowed an occupational disease everyone already knew by name. The American felt industry finally gave up mercury in 1941, switching to a peroxide process that, to no one's surprise, had worked perfectly well all along. It stands as mercury's whole career in miniature. Decades of visible harm. A language that literally had a word for it, and an alternative sitting quietly on the shelf the entire time. Mercury never had its scandal, its single dramatic downfall. It simply retreated, decade by decade, as chemistry learned to measure what it left behind. Out of the syphilis wards, when the first real cures arrived in the early 1900s, out of the teething powders in the 50s, out of the antiseptics. That orange-red mercurochrome your grandparents painted on scraped knees by the 1990s. A pharmacist today handles mercury almost never and signs paperwork when they do. The most beautiful bottle in the old shop turned out to be the one that should never have been opened. After a chapter that heavy in every sense, you've earned something lighter. The next remedy involves no poison at all, and it was administered with the very best intentions, by respectable volunteers to people pulled from the River Thames. It required a pipe, a pair of bellows, a quantity of tobacco smoke, and a part of the patient we shall refer to with the utmost discretion. London, in the 1700s, had a drowning problem. The Thames ran straight through the busiest city in Europe, crowded with wherries and barges, bordered by slick stairs and low railings, and swum in, fallen into, and fished out of daily. Few Londoners could swim, and when someone was pulled from the water, limp and cold, the crowd on the bank faced the oldest emergency question there is: now what? In 1774, two London medical men, an apothecary and a physician, founded a society to answer it, a charitable institution devoted to the rescue of the apparently drowned, soon known as the Royal Humane Society. It offered cash rewards to anyone who pulled a victim from the water and attempted revival, and it published instructions for what to attempt. The society was, in the most literal sense, ahead of its time. It believed, correctly and against much learned opinion, that the line between drowned and dead was blurrier than it looked, and that the recently drowned could sometimes be called back. London was not even first. The idea had come from Amsterdam, a city with even more water per citizen, where a society for the rescue of the drowned had been founded in 1767, complete with printed instructions and cash premiums, and which claimed within a few years a tally of lives saved running into the hundreds. The notion spread along the waterways of Europe like a fashion. Hamburg, Venice, Paris, then London. It's worth appreciating what a genuinely radical idea this was. For most of history, a drowned body was a settled matter, a fate, not an emergency. These societies proposed, against theology and common sense alike, that death had an early, negotiable stage, that a bystander, armed with a pamphlet and nerve, could argue with it. Every modern first aid course descends from that proposal. The trouble was the methods. Warmth was sensible enough. Blankets, warm ashes, a bed by the fire, vigorous rubbing, reasonable. But the 18th century's crown jewel of resuscitation, the technique with its own dedicated equipment, was this: tobacco smoke, delivered by bellows into the rectum of the patient. The logic, and there is always logic, went like so. Tobacco, newly arrived from the Americas, was understood to be a powerful stimulant, hot and dry in the old humoral vocabulary, exactly what a cold, waterlogged body needed. And the chosen route of administration was thought to deliver that stimulating warmth most directly to the bowels, the body's furnace. Kits were manufactured. Handsome wooden boxes containing bellows, flexible tubes, and nozzles. and the Royal Humane Society stationed them along the Thames at intervals, the way we mount defibrillators on walls today. Ferrymen knew where the nearest one hung. There are recorded accounts of revivals credited to the smoke. The patients, one assumes, revived by the warmth, the rubbing, the jostling, and time, with the tobacco taking the bow. For a few decades, this was simply what a well-equipped rescue looked like. And you may have heard, perhaps in a documentary very much like this one, that the practice is where English got its phrase about blowing smoke up a certain part of the anatomy. It is a lovely story, and this channel regrets to report that it isn't true. The people who trace words for a living have looked, and the phrase doesn't appear until the 1960s, long after the bellows were forgotten. Plain old smoke had simply meant empty deception for centuries, no apparatus required. A false etymology attached to a false cure. There's something almost too fitting in that, and we pass it along in the spirit of this whole episode. Check the label. The other rescue methods of the age deserve their own gentle inventory, because each one was somebody's best idea. The drowned were draped over trotting horses so the rhythm might jog the lungs back to work. They were rolled back and forth over barrels. They were hung by the heels on the theory that the water would simply pour out like emptying a boot. They were bled, of course. There was no emergency the Lancet declined to attend. Some of these, by pure mechanical accident, occasionally pressed a chest in and out enough to move air, which is why the barrel and the horse linger distantly in the family tree of CPR. And here is the quiet heartbreak of the chapter. The right answer was already known. In 1732, a Scottish surgeon named William Taussig had revived a suffocated coal miner using nothing but his own breath, mouth to mouth, and published an account of it. Midwives, for their part, had been discreetly breathing life into limp newborns since long before anyone wrote it down. But the learned societies could never quite bring themselves to endorse the technique. It was considered undignified, vulgar, even, this pressing of mouths with a stranger pulled from the river. And the chemistry of the day argued that exhaled breath was spent air, emptied of whatever made air nourishing and therefore useless to a patient. So the method that actually worked sat on the shelf for the better part of 2 centuries, set aside not because it failed, but because it embarrassed people, while the bellows and the tobacco, which were dignified and mechanical and wrong, hung in their handsome boxes along the river. Etiquette, it turns out, can be a cause of death. The tobacco bellows met their end in 1811, when an English researcher named Benjamin Brodie did the simple, devastating thing. He tested it. Nicotine, his animal experiments showed, does not stimulate a struggling heart. It can stop one. The stimulant was a depressant. The rescue was a hazard. The kits came down off the walls along the Thames over the following years, and resuscitation began its slow, stumbling march toward the breath and compressions we teach today. A march that would take another century and a half to arrive. A pharmacist can't help noting the moral hiding in the bellows box. The rote of administration matters as much as the drug, and enthusiasm is not evidence. The Royal Humane Society's volunteers were not fools. They were brave. organized and generous, everything you'd want at the riverbank. And they were also wrong because no one had counted yet. When someone finally counted, the practice ended within a generation. Hold that thought. It is the quiet hero of the rest of this episode. Because counting was about to meet its greatest adversary. Everything so far, the Theriac, the mumia, the lancet, the smoke, was at least sincere. The healers believed. But across the Atlantic, in the young United States, a new creature was stepping onto the stage. The professional seller of cures who did not particularly care whether they worked, so long as the bottle was handsome and the story was good. The golden age of the medicine show was coming, and it was going to be magnificent. Chapter 7. The Golden Age of Patent Medicine. Picture a town in Kansas, some warm evening in the 1880s. A wagon has arrived, painted, lantern lit, with a fold-down stage. There is a banjo player. There is perhaps a man in buckskins, or a conjurer, or a chorus of singers. And when the crowd is warm and laughing, the doctor steps out. He is not a doctor, in a silk hat, holding up a bottle that catches the lamplight, and begins to speak of miracles. This is the medicine show, and for about 50 years it was one of the great American entertainments. The show was free. The bottle was not. They were called patent medicines, though almost none were patented. A real patent would have required disclosing the recipe, and the recipe was the one thing never disclosed. What the makers actually owned were trademarks, names and labels and faces marketed with a brilliance that modern advertising still studies. Because these men had discovered something genuinely new, not a cure, but a system. Newspapers were exploding across America, hungry for advertising, and patent medicines became their single biggest customers. Whole pages of the frontier press were cures for catarrh, for neuralgia, for weak blood, tired nerves, female complaints, and lost manhood. The remedies funded the newspapers that praised them. It was, in its way, a perfect machine. And what was in the bottles? Mostly alcohol. Frequently opium or morphine. Sometimes cocaine. The age's bestsellers were, pharmacologically speaking, Cocktails with Paperwork, Lydia Pinkham's Vegetable Compound, the era's great remedy for women's ailments, its founder's kindly face on every label, one of the most recognized portraits in America, was roots and herbs in a base of roughly 20% alcohol, in an era when respectable women did not drink. Grandmother's tonic was 40 proof. Nobody said this aloud, and everybody's tonic worked by supper time. The darkest bottles were the gentlest sounding. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething infants soothed them with morphine. It sold for decades before the medical journals began calling it, flatly, a baby killer. We'll let that one pass by quietly, the way the era eventually did. But it belongs in the ledger, because it is the reason the reckoning, when it finally came so hard. And then there is the bottle that named the whole genre. Snake oil did not begin as a fraud. Chinese laborers building the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s brought with them a traditional liniment made from the fat of Chinese water snakes, which they rubbed on aching joints, and which their American workmates noticed seemed genuinely to help. Modern analysis offers a wry footnote. That water snake fat is unusually rich in omega-3 fatty acids. The original snake oil, in other words, may have been mildly, honestly useful. What America did with the idea was another matter. Enter Clark Stanley, a showman in fringed buckskin, self-titled the Rattlesnake King, who claimed to have learned secret cures from Hopi medicine men. At the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, before delighted crowds, he pulled live rattlesnakes from a sack, slit them, and boiled them on the spot, skimming the fat into vials as the audience watched. Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, made before your very eyes. It sold gloriously for over 20 years. In 1917, federal chemists finally got around to analyzing a shipment. Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment contained mineral oil, a little beef fat, red pepper, turpentine, and camphor. No snake. Not a trace of snake. The Rattlesnake King's cure held, as its whole inventory of serpents, 0. He was fined $20, about the price of a decent suit, and did not contest it. And that is how snake oil came to mean fraud itself. Not because the original oil was fake, but because the most famous bottle of it never met a snake. Not every bottle from that era vanished, though. And this is the part of the chapter you can verify in any grocery store tonight. Some patent medicines that survived by quietly becoming refreshments. The drugstore soda fountain existed in the first place because carbonated water was itself considered a health tonic, and the druggist was its natural dispenser. In Atlanta in 1886, a pharmacist named John Pemberton, wounded Confederate veteran, chasing relief for his own pains, formulated a nerve tonic from coca leaf and the caffeine-rich cola nut, and sold it at the fountain as a brain and nerve remedy. He called it Coca-Cola after its 2 medicinal ingredients. The cocaine was engineered out in the early 1900s as the mood turned. The medicine claims followed, and the tonic simply carried on as a beverage, conquering the planet out of uniform. Decades later, in 1929, a new lemon-lime drink launched under the catchy name bib label lithiated lemon-lime soda. Lithiated, as in containing lithium, the mood-steadying element, which remained in the recipe until 1948. You know it today as 7-Up. And tonic water still carries real quinine, the genuine malaria medicine British officers in India dosed themselves with daily, adding gin, in one of history's most successful efforts to make a prescription palatable. The medicine show never entirely closed. Part of it just moved to the beverage aisle and stopped making claims. It's easy from here to see only the swindle, but sit with the buyers for a moment, because they were not stupid. A farm family in 1885 lived a day's ride from a doctor who could, in truth, do very little. This is still the age of calomel and the lancet, remember. The bottle in the general store cost less than the doctor's visit, tasted of cinnamon and courage, and came with the one thing the era's real medicine rarely offered: confidence. The label promised. When the historians say patent medicine sold hope by the fluid ounce, that is not entirely an insult. Hope has always been part of the pharmacopoeia. The crime was in what else was in the bottle, and in what the label didn't say. A modern pharmacist reads those old labels with a shiver of recognition. The secret formula. The testimonial from a satisfied stranger. The single product good for a dozen unrelated ailments. The gentle suggestion that doctors don't want you to know. Every one of those is still in circulation tonight, sliding through a feed somewhere wearing newer fonts. The wagon became a website. The pitch never changed. The pitch was, however, about to meet something it couldn't out-talk. Not a regulator, not yet, but a discovery. In 1898, in a shed in Paris, a quiet Polish-born physicist and her husband isolated a new element that did something no substance had ever done. It glowed, all by itself, with its own inner light. The world took one look at that light and decided, with the purest miracle cure logic of all, that it must be health itself, distilled. They put it in water. They put it in face cream. They put it for a while in chocolate. Every miracle cure in this episode borrowed its magic from somewhere. From vipers, from pharaohs, from the vital heat of tobacco. Radium didn't need to borrow. Radium performed its own miracle, nightly, on demand. It glowed. A speck of it in a darkened room shed a soft, blue-green, unwavering light, with no flame, no fuel, and no explanation the 19th century could offer. Marie and Pierre Curie announced its discovery in 1898, coaxed over years from tons of dull brown ore in a Paris shed with a leaking roof. Marie would later write about coming to the laboratory at night just to look at the shelves, the little tubes and dishes gleaming in the dark like faint fairy lights. Science had produced many wonders, but it had never produced anything that looked so much like bottled life. And that, before a single experiment said so, is exactly what the world decided it was. The reasoning practically wrote itself. Energy was vitality, vitality was health, and here was pure energy, pouring endlessly out of a grain of salt-like powder. Within a few years, radium was the most glamorous word in commerce, attached to anything a label could be glued to. There was radium face cream sold in elegant Parisian jars. A French line called Theriac promised the complexion of the future. There was a German radioactive toothpaste for luminous gums and vigor of the mouth, radium chocolate. Radium bread, briefly, from an enterprising bakery. Wool underthings, radium infused, for warmth of a scientific kind. Much of this, it should be said in fairness to the swindlers, contained no radium at all. Real radium was fabulously expensive, which made those particular frauds, by the logic of this episode, accidentally merciful. But some products were exactly what they claimed. You could buy a ceramic water crock lined with uranium ore, the revigator, and let your drinking water steep overnight in its cheerful radioactivity, a glass of sunshine with breakfast. And at the top of the market, for the discerning customer, there was a little half-ounce bottle called Radithor, triple distilled water containing certified, guaranteed, genuine radium. Its maker meant that certification sincerely. That was the tragedy. Radithor was the creation of one William J. A. Bailey, a Harvard dropout who awarded himself a doctorate and wore it comfortably for the rest of his life. Radithor was not even his first radioactive venture. Before the water, Bailey had sold the radioendocrinator, a wafer of radium-soaked material in a handsome 14-karat gold case to be worn against the body overnight, and gentlemen were advised, with a straight face, to wear it in a special harness beneath the waistline, close to the glands most in need of invigoration. It sold, at its debut, for $1,000, several new Fords worth of gold-cased blotting paper. The whole logic of the age is in that little gold case. Radiation as vitality, applied as close to the source of manhood as the postal regulations would allow. Bailey, it should be said, appears to have been a true believer. He drank his own water, by his own account, in quantity. He lived until 1949, longer than he had any right to. When researchers exhumed his body 20 years later to study it, his bones were still measurably radioactive. He remains one of the strangest figures in this whole episode, a fraud in his credentials, sincere in his poison. His most devoted customer was a man named Eben Byers, a Pittsburgh industrialist, a socialite, an amateur golf champion, the kind of confident modern man the 20s were invented for. After an arm injury in 1927, a physician suggested Radithor for the pain, and Byers became a believer. He drank a bottle a day, sometimes several, for years. By the usual count, somewhere around 1,400 bottles. He recommended it to friends. He sent cases of it to a lady acquaintance. He fed some, it is said, to his racehorses. Radium, the body discovers too late, is chemically a cousin of calcium. The skeleton takes it in and builds it into bone, where it keeps shining day and night from the inside. By 1930, Byers' jaw was failing. Surgeons removed most of it. His bones thinned and broke. He gave his testimony to federal investigators from his sick bed, still lucid, still courteous, and died in the spring of 1932. He was buried, by necessity, in a coffin lined with lead. His epitaph took nearly 60 years to arrive, and it was worth the wait. In 1990, a Wall Street Journal writer, looking back on the whole affair, gave it a headline of perfect American bluntness. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. You will find that line quoted all over the internet as a headline from 1932, as though the newspapers said it over his coffin. They didn't. It was written in hindsight. But hindsight, as it happens, is where this entire episode lives. Byers was the famous case, but not the first warning. The dial-painting girls of New Jersey and Illinois, young women who tipped their brushes to a point between their lips, painting luminous numbers on watch faces, had been sickening for a decade, and their long fight for recognition was already in the courts. Their story deserves, and will someday get, a quieter telling of its own. For tonight it's enough to say, the science that finally measured radium's harm was built, in large part, on what was learned from them, and workplace radiation protection descends directly from their case. What Byers' death added was velocity. He was rich, famous, and photographed. His ruin could not be filed away. The Federal Trade Commission moved on Radithor, and radioactive patent medicines were effectively finished within the decade. The pharmacist's footnote here is a gentle paradox. Radium did have a place in medicine after all, aimed, carefully and briefly, at tumors, where its destructiveness was the point. The poison and the cure were the same glow. The whole difference, as with Mercury, as with opium, as with everything on tonight's shelf, was dose, aim, and honesty. Radium at least was real, a genuine force, genuinely misapplied. Our last family of miracle cures had a subtler ingredient. It ran on no element at all. It ran on the patient, on belief itself, drawn out with magnets, tubs, rods, and splendid theatrical conviction. And in exposing it, a committee that included Benjamin Franklin would accidentally invent the most important tool in all of modern medicine, the fair test. Chapter 9. Animal Magnetism, Electric Belts, and the Discovery of the Placebo. In the Paris of the 1780s, powdered, perfumed, and bored, the most fashionable address in medicine belonged to a Viennese physician named Franz Anton Mesmer. He had arrived trailing rumors of marvelous cures, and his theory was as grand as the age itself. The universe, he taught, is filled with an invisible magnetic fluid flowing through every living thing, and illness is simply that flow gone wrong. The healer's gift, his gift, was to sense and redirect it. He called it animal magnetism. His clinic was pure theater, and I mean that with admiration. Patients gathered in a dim salon around a great wooden tub, the bakeway, filled with water and iron filings, bristling with bent iron rods. They gripped the rods, or held ropes, or joined hands in a circle. Soft music played on a glass harmonica, an instrument whose eerie shimmer Franklin himself had invented. And then Mesmer entered, in a lilac silk robe, passing slowly among them, fixing his eyes on each patient, sweeping his hands along the lines of their bodies without quite touching. Patients trembled. Some wept or laughed or fell into convulsive crises and were carried gently to a mattress-lined recovery room. And many, this is the part that matters, many walked out feeling genuinely, sometimes lastingly, better. Paris went mad for him, which is how, in 1784, King Louis XVI appointed a royal commission to investigate, and staffed it with, among others, the chemist Lavoisier, the physician Guillotin, and the American ambassador, one Benjamin Franklin, then 78 and too gout-ridden to leave his garden, which suited everyone because the commission came to him. What that commission did in the garden at Passy was so simple and so devastating that medicine has never stopped using it since. They did not ask whether patients improved. Plainly, some did. They asked whether the magnetism was real, and they designed the question fairly. They blindfolded people. A magnetized subject, blindfolded, was told a magnetizer was present when none was, and fell into a full crisis anyway. Told the magnetism came from a particular tree. A sensitive young man embraced the wrong, untreated tree, and collapsed at it, overwhelmed. A lady given plain water believed it magnetized with dramatic effect. Given truly magnetized water without her knowledge, she noticed nothing. Trial after gentle trial, the pattern held. The Commission's report is one of the quiet masterpieces of scientific prose. The fluid does not exist, it concluded. The effects are real, but they proceed from imagination. Everything happening in Mesmer's salon was coming from inside the patients. They meant it as a debunking. It was. Mesmer left Paris under a cloud, and mesmerized survives only as a word for what his eyes did. But read it again, slowly, and the report is also a discovery, one of the greatest in medical history. Belief alone, properly staged, can produce real, measurable relief. We call it the placebo effect now, and every honest drug trial on Earth, every blinded, controlled study your pharmacist has ever read, is a great-grandchild of Franklin's blindfolds. To find out if the medicine works, you must first subtract the theater. It took another century and a half for medicine to fully absorb that lesson, but it was all there, in a Paris garden, in 1784. Not that anyone stopped selling the theater. Oh no. The next 100 years simply recostumed it in the age's new magic. Electricity. In Connecticut, a doctor named Elisha Perkins patented a pair of pointed metal rods, Perkins tractors, that drew disease out of the body when stroked across the skin. George Washington bought a set. An English physician named John Haygarth then repeated Franklin's trick in 1799 with wooden replicas painted to look like metal, produced identical cures, and published the result under a title that said everything of the imagination as a cause and as a cure of disorders of the body. The grandest theatre of all had opened in London, even while Mesmer still held court in Paris. A Scottish showman physician named James Graham established his Temple of Health near the Thames in 1780. A townhouse of perfumed air, soft music, electrical apparatus crackling decorously in the corners, and attendants costumed as goddesses of health, one of whom, by some accounts, historians permit themselves a raised eyebrow here, was a teenaged Emma, later Lady Hamilton, the great love of Admiral Nelson. The temple's centerpiece, up the grand staircase, was the celestial bed, 12 feet by 9, riding on glass pillars, wired with magnets and electrical devices, canopied with mirrors and fresh flowers, engineered to tilt gently, with music piped from an organ as the occasion required. Childless couples could hire a night in it at a price that would rent a respectable London house for a year, with conception all but guaranteed by the magnetic fires. Graham was bankrupt within a few years and drifted into ever stranger enthusiasms, ending as an advocate of earth bathing, lecturing while buried to the neck in soil. But for one glittering season, the most fashionable medical treatment in the English-speaking world was an electric bed with a soundtrack. And still the current flowed. The Victorians could buy electric belts, some with discreet attachments, promising restored manhood by voltaic means, electric corsets, electric hairbrushes, violet ray wands that crackled with harmless purple sparks and cured, said the catalog. Nearly everything. In the early 20th century, a San Francisco doctor named Albert Abrams grew rich diagnosing every disease from a single drop of dried blood mailed to his machines. Skeptical investigators, in one of debunking's finest hours, mailed him blood from a healthy rooster. The diagnosis came back promptly. It was not good news for the rooster. A sinus infection and bad teeth. The machines hummed. The dials were magnificent. Inside them was, usually, literally, a tangle of wires connected nothing. The pharmacist's beat, this time, is the tenderest one in the episode. The placebo effect is not a synonym for fraud. It is a real, measurable feature of human beings. Comfort, expectation, ritual, and attention converting into genuine relief. Every good clinician uses it honestly. The confident explanation, the unhurried visit, the reassurance that things are going to be all right. The crime of the Quacks was never that they invoked it. It's that they invoked only it, charged for lightning, and delivered wire connected to nothing. Which brings us, at last, to the reckoning. 5,000 years of miracle cures, and in the space of about 60, within a single long lifetime, the wagons, the tonics, the radium water, and the humming boxes were all swept from the respectable shelf. It took a magazine crusade, a poisoned elixir, a sleepless government reviewer, and a great deal of grief. It is, in its quiet, bureaucratic way, One of the happiest endings in this whole long story. Chapter 10. Taming the Quacks. Every remedy in this episode flourished in the same convenient darkness. Nobody had to say what was in the bottle, and nobody had to prove a word of the label. For most of history, there was no had to at all. The story of this final chapter is the slow construction, plank by plank, scandal by scandal, of the had to. It begins not with a law, but with a magazine. In the autumn of 1905, Collier's Weekly began running a series by a journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams, under a title that pulled no punches: The Great American Fraud. Adams did the unglamorous thing the medicine men feared most. He bought the bottles and had them analyzed. Then he printed the results, brand by beloved brand. The soothing syrups running on morphine, the consumption cures running on chloroform, the tonics running on cheap alcohol at champagne prices, the testimonial letters from satisfied customers who turned out, on inspection, to be dead. 11 articles, 500,000 reprints, and a nation that had been winking at its medicine cabinet for 50 years finally looked inside it. Washington, meanwhile, had been running the strangest dinner party in government history. The chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture, Harvey Washington Wiley, had spent years trying to get anyone to care what the era's food and medicine preservatives actually did to a human body. And in 1902, lacking any law to enforce, he resorted to demonstration. He recruited 12 healthy young volunteers, mostly government clerks, and fed them their meals in a basement dining room at the department. Good cooking, carefully weighed and accompanied, course by course in capsules of rising dose, by the preservatives of the day: borax, salicylic acid, formaldehyde. The volunteers signed waivers, submitted to weekly examinations, and kept eating as the doses climbed and their appetites, stomachs, and general enthusiasm declined on schedule. All of it recorded in Wiley's meticulous tables. The press discovered them and fell instantly in love, naming them the Poison Squad, and a vaudeville-friendly motto attached itself to the enterprise: Only the brave dare eat the fair. It was scientific theater of the highest order. The medicine show's own weapons turned around and aimed at the medicine show, and Wiley rode the publicity all the way to the committee rooms. The 1906 law, when it finally passed, was known for years simply as the Wiley Act. At almost the same moment, a novelist named Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, meaning to expose the misery of immigrant workers in Chicago's packing houses, and instead sent America reeling from its descriptions of what went into the sausage. As Sinclair ruefully said, he aimed at the public's heart and hit its stomach. Between Adams' bottles and Sinclair's sausages, Congress could no longer look away, and in June of 1906, Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act. By modern standards, it was a modest little law. It did not ban a single quack remedy. It did not require that medicines work. That idea was still half a century away. It required essentially one thing. The label had to tell the truth. If the soothing syrup contained morphine, the word morphine had to appear on the bottle. No more secret formulas containing surprise opium. No more claiming contents that weren't there. And that alone, sunlight on the label, did remarkable damage to the miracle cure business. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, with morphine printed plainly on it, stopped being something a mother reached for without thinking. Sales of the great narcotic nostrums sagged and never recovered. It turns out a large share of the golden age had been running entirely on the customer not knowing, but the law had a hole in it big enough to drive a medicine wagon through. It policed ingredients, not promises. You could no longer lie about what was in the bottle, but you could still say the bottle cured cancer. Closing that hole took 30 years and, in the end, a tragedy. Because the sad rhythm of drug regulation, then and since, is that the rules are written in the aftermath. In 1937, a respectable Tennessee drug company had a genuinely good product on its hands, sulfanilamide, one of the first true antibacterial drugs, a real medicine that really worked. Customers wanted it as a liquid, especially for children. The company's chief chemist found that it dissolved nicely in a sweet, syrupy solvent called diethylene glycol. Added some raspberry flavor and shipped elixir sulfanilamide across the country. No one tested the solvent for safety. No law said they had to. Diethylene glycol is a cousin of antifreeze, and it is poisonous to the kidneys. Over 100 people died, a great many of them children, being treated for sore throats, and the company had broken, technically, almost no law. The government's strongest charge was that calling it an elixir implied alcohol it didn't contain. A mislabeling. The chemist took his own life, and within a year, Congress passed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the law that built the modern FDA. With the provision every medicine on every shelf tonight still lives under, you must prove a drug is safe before you may sell it. Not after. Before. One more plank remained. Safe is not the same as effective. The law still didn't ask whether medicines worked. That plank was nailed down in 1962 after the world watched thalidomide, a sedative sold across Europe for morning sickness, caused thousands of catastrophic birth defects, while in America, a single stubborn FDA reviewer named Francis Kelsey, unsatisfied with the evidence, had simply kept declining to approve it. 60 years of consumer protection law, and its greatest single victory was one careful scientist repeatedly saying, "Not yet." The 1962 amendments made her caution the rule. From then on, a drug must be proven safe and proven to work in adequate and well-controlled trials. Franklin's blindfolds, at last, written into federal law. And so the wagons stopped. The Theriac jars went to museums, the radium water off the shelves, the secret formulas into court exhibits. The pharmacy your pharmacist stands in tonight. Every child-proof cap, every ingredient list, every boring paragraph of fine print is the visible wreckage of everything in this episode. Each rule is a scar with a story attached. Regulations, a wise engineer once said, are written in blood. In pharmacy, they are written in elixir sulfanilamide. Did the miracle cures die, though? You already know the answer. Walk any drugstore tonight, past the pharmacy counter with its proofs and its paperwork, and you will come to a bright, cheerful aisle where the old spirit lives on within the letter of the law. Supplements and tonics and detoxes, ancient secrets and immune support. Promises pitched just carefully enough. The label may not lie about what's inside. The dream it sells is the same one Mithridates bought. And perhaps that's the gentlest conclusion this history offers. The miracle cure was never really a product. It was a wish. To be well, to be safe, to be looked after. And wishes don't expire. We just learned, slowly, at great kin over 5,000 years, to make the sellers of wishes show their work. And that is where we'll leave it tonight. If you're still awake, and it's perfectly all right if you're not, you've traveled a long way. From honey on a wound beside the Nile, to viper flesh aged like wine in Venice, past the apothecaries' drawer of powdered faro and the barber's spiral pole, through the silver shimmer of Mercury, and a cloud of well-intentioned tobacco smoke. Across the lamplit stage of the medicine show, into the soft blue glow of the Radium age, around Mesmer's tub, and home at last to the plainest miracle of all, a label that tells the truth. 5,000 years of cures that didn't work, sold by people who mostly believed in them, to people who needed to believe in something. And threaded through all of it, the same slow lesson, learned and forgotten and learned again. Hope is a fine ingredient, but it should never be the only one. Thank you for spending this night with the sleepy history of medicine. If these long, quiet histories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe for the next one. There are so many more shelves in this old pharmacy to wander, but there's no hurry about that, or about anything. The rest is history, and history can wait until morning. Sleep well.